Greetings, everyone. My name is Todd Taylor, and I am the host for this month's iteration of the Adobe Digital Literacy Cafe. This is such an enjoyable experience for me because I get to invite the coolest kids I know to come into come to my clubhouse and talk about the stuff they are really, really amazing at. And so I'm just going to ask our guest on the show today to quickly introduce themselves. Sheneese, begin with you. Just say a quick hi.
Hi, everybody. Dr. Sheneese Thompson. I'm an assistant professor at Bowie State University in the Department of Language, Literature, and Cultural Studies.
And Justin.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I see from all over the country. My name is Justin Hodgson, and I am an associate professor of digital rhetoric at Indiana University Bloomington, but I'm also the co-director of our Digital Gardener Initiative across IU, which is a digital literacy initiative helping students improve their digital literacy skills and their digital creativity in the classroom.
And again, my name is Todd Taylor. My business card for Adobe has the title of Pedagogical Evangelist. I'm also an English professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I am broadcasting from my office in Greenlaw Hall, if anyone's ever been here. And I used to direct the first year writing program. And so what brings us together today in the Digital Literacy Cafe, and this is a very casual format, is a persistent question, especially for folks who are new to asking their students to create digital academic projects. How do I assess this thing? How do I measure it? How do I grade it? But just as importantly, how do I design the project or the assignment from the get-go, so that when we're getting into the assessment phase, so to speak, of the project, there's coherence. There isn't disconnections in everything we're doing. We're all pulling and rowing in the same direction. And so that is a consistent conversation that is always part of every sort of faculty development experience that I know Justin and Sheneese and I have been a part of. And now it's even more heavily inflected in terms of its importance. Now that AI technology has entered into the higher education space, so that most students are aware of its influence on writing and creating student assignments. So we're going to have a three-part conversation. We're going to begin with where Sheneese and Justin currently are and their thoughts about assessment in general. And then the middle piece, we're going to specifically focus on their experiences and their perspectives with multimodal, with assessing multimodal projects, that is digital projects such as video or posters or podcasts or websites or mobile app prototypes, whatever it might be. How does now, when we think about assessing multimodal work, how does that maybe inflect or illuminate the assessment designs and choices we're making? And then lastly, we'll say, okay, now let's think about AI technology, and how does that then inflect the choices we make as leaders, as instructors, as professors in higher education. So I'm really grateful to have all of you here with us today, and especially these two incredible scholars and teachers to help us figure this out collectively in a community. And so this is a very casual format. It's a talk show format that I'm sure all of you are familiar with now. The chat pod is only for just sort of social things that you want to say, and so that we can share some URLs and resources with you. We will follow up with an email so you can see the recording, so you can get the links to the resources. If you want to ask a question directly of us, though, please look at the bottom of your Zoom screen where it says Q&A. Click that Q&A, and then we have Paula in the background from Adobe, who's going to try to field those questions and bubble them up to us, because it's kind of hard for us to both concentrate on the conversation and that Q&A pod. And that's how we're gonna operate today. So again, thank you everyone for being here, especially the two guests, the two cool kids in the clubhouse today. Sheneese, we'll begin with you. Where does the conversation about assessment begin for you? And what are some things that you're doing recently or right now that can help illustrate your perspectives on assessing student work?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Todd. So we've talked in the past, but I think being in language, literature, and cultural studies gives us a lot of room to play. And so I've taken every opportunity to do that. And so for my literature seminars, I've gotten rid of the term paper completely. My students are going to do podcasts this semester. And so I found myself basically adapting my term paper rubric to my podcast rubric, and so starting with the end in mind. So, what am I really assessing for? And so, for me, I'm assessing for the same things that I would be assessing for in the term paper, which is their ability to sustain long form literary analysis, critical thinking about whichever book that they choose, because I give them the option to choose something we've read on the syllabus or something else, but which fits into the time frame or the topic that we're discussing. And so then I found myself working backwards to tinker with the rubric so that it fit the new format, which is to say the new medium, but understanding that essentially what I'm assessing for is quite the same, just a different medium.
Cool. And so, do you have that rubric to
I
share
do.
and
I
then sort of
do.
illustrate what you're talking about?
Yes, I
And
do.
actually, I'm sorry, I should back up one level. Would you tell the folks out there about your university and about your program, so those who may not know about Bowie State can kind of picture where you are in the wonderful service and work you're doing there?
Absolutely. So I'm at Bowie State University, which is the oldest HBCU in the state of Maryland. We serve a little over 6,000 students total, most of which being undergrads and most of which being local to the state of Maryland, although we have over 40 countries represented. Most of our students who are undergraduates are also commuter students. So we have a very interesting population of students, which for whom staying on campus is not their primary residence. Many live at home, many live other points. And the great news is that Maryland has excellent public transportation. So our students are coming from sometimes as far as Baltimore on campus to take their courses. And so we've, since the pandemic, like most other institutions, have expanded our online course offerings. So even offering even more robust options for our students who are commuting to and from campus. And so I come from a very large language, literature, and cultural studies department, which was formerly the Department of English. So we house modern languages, a BA in English, and a BS in English for our students who are in the education program. They can graduate with a BS in English secondary education. So they get their teaching certificate as well. So we have a very, very broad program, and our cultural studies major is under development. And so in my department, I am the course coordinator for Africana Literatures, which is a major and minor track. We also have British literature, American literature as well. So that's a little bit about our institution.
All right, awesome. Now, as you're sharing this rubric that we were looking at the other day, obviously you come from a literary, discipline background. But as much as you can, talk about how the principles that you're showing in your approach to assignment design and assessment might be relevant for any course in the economics or even outside the humanities, as much as that's possible and comfortable for you to talk about.
Absolutely. And so one of the things we've been discussing is like disciplinary convention. Like all of us have disciplinary convention. And so where you find your disciplinary convention showing up in your assessment and showing up in your assignment design, I think that's the place where you would start. And so for me, in terms of this rubric design, I stayed very, very close to what my students are familiar with seeing, right? So where possible, at least in my case, I like for my students to be like, we're doing a new thing, but in a familiar way. Right. And so if that works for you in your assignment design, then that's a great approach, right? Because the goal is to give students an opportunity to do something new and creative, but not to shock them or scare them. And so I followed what they would see in an assignment sheet, which in our case is usually in two parts. There's a detailed assignment description with steps for them to follow, and then an actual rubric for their assessment. So the page you should be seeing now, and my hope is that all of you can see it, is what I'm asking the students to have. So the first thing that they should supply to me, which all of them have already, because we're rolling late into the semester. So this is happening in real time. I'm sharing what my students are currently doing. All of them have submitted to me an outline, which did include a story synopsis. So they had to give me a summary of the story that they're going to use, their points of analysis, because they need to have a thesis statement, even though this is a podcast, and then a checklist for labor distribution. I gave my students an option to either work solo or in a group. And what's interesting is the students who have decided to work with partners are working with partners who are not in the class. I have one superstar student who's graduating, which makes me elated and sad, who decided to do some analysis of the story that she chose from the literary perspective, but also criminal justice and psychology. And so she's working with two of her friends who have those majors to do that on the podcast. So they also need to give me a checklist of labor distribution if they decided to work with other people. Okay, so their drafts are due this Sunday. So that's where we are in the podcast, assignment draft. So the draft is designed for them to give me at least 8 minutes of audio, right? Number one, so I can see that they are becoming comfortable with using the software. But number two, so that I can give them feedback, substantive feedback on the content that they're sharing. So if they need to pivot, change directions, tweak in terms of their content, then I can give them that feedback. And so I treat it very much like I would have treated a writing assignment, which makes it iterative, which they keep coming back to it. So they give me an outline, they give me a draft, I give them feedback at each stage of the process, and then they finally submit a final podcast. I've also asked them to submit a script. And as I've said to them, the script is not word for word, which would be a transcript. I want them to submit a script for them to follow. And so that I understand that they've done this thinking about the actual stages of development and the composition of the podcast. So that's the purpose of the script. So we haven't moved completely away from writing as a medium, but we have talked about the way that writing and podcasts in terms of a medium of delivery play with each other. And so if I could move on, you should now be seeing the actual rubric in terms of how they're being assessed. A big question is, well, how much does the podcast itself, their use of Adobe Rush play into how I'm assessing them? And the truth is very little, right? So technical competence represents 20 points on their total score, right? So therefore, even if the technical competence was like abysmal, which I do not expect, but even if it was, it would not be enough to fail them on the assignment. In fact, they could come out with an 80, even if I gave them like 0 points for this, because the goal is for them to learn a new skill, acquire some technical familiarity with the software, but really show me that they understand that they can analyze a topic, they can carry a conversation, even if it's with themselves, along. One of my students who's working alone has decided to do a compare and contrast between 2 Langston Hughes stories. And so that he's able to carry that through the duration of the podcast in a way that is cohesive. And so I'm judging them most heavily on the content, which is to say it is clear and it shows depth of knowledge, understanding. And then analysis, right? 20 points. Have you actually analyzed the thing, or have you only summarized it? And those are things that I'm looking for even in the term paper, because for some of my students who struggle with the writing process, it is hard for them to move from summary toward analysis. And so I'm looking for them to do that also in the podcast. Is it organized, right? All of us who are listening to podcasts have podcasts that have a format, which is to say some sort of introduction, whatever the meat of that podcast is, and then whatever the summary or closing remarks are. Sometimes that includes questions from listeners. Sometimes that includes a nice little sting. Sometimes there's intro and outro music. But either way, I'm asking them to look at organization in the same way that they would do in a paper, which has maybe subheadings that helps guide the reader through the writing. So again, technical competence, very little. It's recorded, which is to say there's some audio for me to listen to, and it's edited, which is to say it is clean. And so there's levels to this, which is to say there's not clean and unclean. So we have a little bit of a spectrum here in terms of what that would look like. But I'm basically looking for them to have something recorded that I can listen to and hear. which is to say I can give them feedback on it. And then references, this is still a research project. I'm looking for them to integrate some other analysis or existing discourse in the conversation that they're having. I've given them free range on how to do that. So that some of them have guest speakers, others of them will be name dropping, which is to say, oh, when I read this, or when I've read that, or some other scholars have written that. And so that is still very much a part of the process. So I do hope that my discussion of this rubric and the assignment itself in terms of how I structured it does help even for other disciplines in terms of my rationale.
Awesome. And so we're going to take a deeper dive into some of these questions in the second segment when we're talking about multimedia work in particular. But and this is a bit of an unfair question. If we were to zoom out based upon the assignment prompt and the rubric that you just showed me, what are some of the 2 or 3 most important thoughts in your mind when it comes to the question of assessment? What are the things you're most focused on in terms of the way that you're approaching assessment on a particular project, maybe as illustrated by the sample that you just gave us?
Sure. I think fairness is key for me. So I tend to create assignments that help students do what I'm actually assessing them for, if that makes sense. And I think we all started this conversation in Utah, where I was saying it didn't make sense for me to give my students time writing assignments, because even if they pursue a graduate study in English, there's never going to be a time for them to do any kind of lengthy analysis where they wouldn't have the text in front of them. Mm-hmm. And so I tend to assess my students in ways that are going to make sense for them as they go into the fields that they're going to be in. So the same thing is true here. I have students who are brilliant in terms of their ability to hold meaningful conversations, ask meaningful questions about the content. And we understand now that podcasting is a field which they could go into and earn money. I mean, meaningfully earn for themselves, even if they decide to do a number of other things. And so this assessment is driven by the fact that if they decide to go further with this is a skill set that they can apply in their lives, right? Not just I assess them in a vacuum for what they can do under pressure with in a timed environment. And also for me, I design the assignment last. So for me, I'm always thinking about what am I assessing them for? How will I assess them? And then how can I design a assignment which will give them the opportunity to do it? So working backwards, I think are the top 3, if that answers your question.
Awesome. Wonderful. All right, we're going to come back to you and we're going to talk specifically about how you feel that assigning digital work might inflect or give you a different perspective on assessment. But we want to do the same with Justin now. We want to know what you're working on right now, what you're thinking about right now. Where has your relationship or your guidance regarding assessment gone to as of spring 2023? And so if you'd start just by quickly talking about your campus, just really briefly outline the Digital Gardener initiative, and then talk about the faculty development work you've been working on.
Yeah, so that's good stuff, Sheneese. There's some good questions going on about your work. I'm so intrigued to see where this goes. So one of the things that's happened, I'm at Indiana University. I'm as a faculty, I'm on the Bloomington campus, which is Indiana Hoosiers. We're part of the Big Ten, sort of a R1 institution, but IU is one system, which is we have 7 campuses, 2 regional centers, a medical school, a dental school, and all those kind of things rolled together. So while Bloomington campus is relatively large, 40-some thousand students from all country or all states and from many countries, what I do outside of my work as a faculty is sort of lead faculty development system wide. And so we work with faculty from some of our smaller campuses, some of our regional campuses, our urban campus at IUPUI, to really help folks think about what digital literacy looks like in the classroom and how they can integrate sort of strategies and techniques and approaches to enhance student engagement, to offer new opportunities for student learning through these kind of modalities. And so while my own work is on, writing, I think strangely we're all from the humanities. We should get a scientist here at some point. My initial work is in the humanities orientation of how do we help students better represent their thinking, and then how do we assess that thinking, how do we assess that learning, how do we assess that representation of their thought process. More and more over the past couple of years, it's really I've turned more to thinking about strategies that allow folks who from different disciplines a sort of starting point for assessing digital projects. And part of this began not only my work at IU system-wide, but I've run this thing called the Journal for Undergraduate Multimedia Projects, jumpplus.net, if you're interested. It's built by undergrads for undergrads kind of thing. And I've been running that now for over a decade. And so I've seen a lot of interesting projects over the years that come in. And it's the questions that always plague me are like, how do you assess a video game, right? If a student turns in a video game for a project or instead of an essay. And so this stuff's kind of been mulling around for me for a while. And as part of our faculty development, I run a workshop the other day, just last week, on some core strategies for assessing digital media and digital literacy. And I'll share my screen here real quick to kind of give you all, for those who may not be able to access it. I assume we can all see this now, right? Alrighty. Actually, you know what? That's fine. I am on the. Did I lose it? Or is it still there? Okay, good.
Still there.
Okay, good. I got to move all the things so I can see you while I talk. I'm not good without the face. And so there's Sheneese sort of hit on a couple of things that we start with, which is, basically, what are you trying to assess when you ask students to do a project? What matters is not your technical expertise. What matters is your field knowledge, right? Your disciplinary expertise. And so whether you know how to make a podcast or make a video, you know what this stuff looks like and sounds like in your discipline. And so, there's lots of ways to avoid the technical elements if you're at all concerned about that. But it really is thinking about, what am I trying to assess? Am I looking at a specific product? I'm a writing teacher by trade, so I look at a lot of the process more so than the product. Or do I really want to assess students' learning, but also their own understanding of that learning? And so those kind of things help shape then what kind of artifacts or evidence you need to assess it, and sort of the approaches you might take. If you're like Sheneese and you're teaching a podcast, for the most part, it's a really good place to start, because podcasts typically have defined genre elements. And so if you want to get into the weeds about the technical or the arrangement of a podcast, you can look at plenty of examples of podcasts and say, what are the conventions? What are the expectations? And help establish that with students before you get into your own, like, let's talk about how you're representing knowledge in this concept or construct. And then I always ask questions like, is there a one-size-fit-all heuristic for the projects? Or in my case, I like to give students options. So for this final project, you can write a traditional research paper, or you can make a video, sort of a video essay, or you can make an interactive web text, which is great, because then I'm not grading the same kind of thing over and over again. The downside is that you can't provide a one-size-fits-all heuristic for those kinds of projects, because they're just different in media and in approach. And so it's things like, how do I generate sort of rubrics or evaluative criteria that fit either a broad spectrum of projects, or in my case, I do this a lot. Can I do this in consultation with the students, having them offer some suggestions for how we think about this stuff? And so there's 4 basic approaches I typically start with to kind of guide people through, like, how do you get into assessing digital media? And they're, all these things are meant to be, they're like, I always say they're like recipes when you cook. They're loose guidelines for where you might start, but sometimes you might need extra sugar, or, want a different topping, those kind of things. Yeah, and that was, sorry, I just saw the question. It was jumpplus.net. That's correct. So the SEC approach, not a play on the Southeastern Conference, but rather on the self-evaluative criteria, is really a straightforward thing when you think about how to assess, which is to say, my students have a lot of anxiety about this project. I'm not sure what I'm doing, but I'm going to have them create their own criteria. Tell me what you want to be assessed on. And it puts the onus back on them. And then it can be something as simple as, was I able to complete the project? And we have a negotiation about what those things could look like, but ultimately it's in conversation with them where they establish their own kind of expectations. And then I always have them evaluate themselves for that expectation. The genre approach I mentioned already is perhaps the most stable if you have a clearly defined genre, because you can talk about key features, you can talk about key practices, and you can eliminate some of the confusion there as you get into the depth of considering the content that you're going to assess, right? So, I think you mentioned outros and intros, right, Sheneese? If you don't have an outro and intro and you're a podcast, you've not done well in my class, right? These are my expectations, but we spend time looking at examples and talking about them. And again, it works whether I've seen this work, whether you're in chemistry or you're in, English. The medium is a vehicle to represent your thinking and engagement with the course content. It's not the end all be all of the point of what we're doing. And so it's another way of thinking about how we represent our stories. One of my favorite models, and I use this a lot, and you'll notice these kind of they're more and more complex. So first, the students kind of offer their own evaluative criteria. Then it's a genre analysis criteria. And then more recently, we've been doing a lot with the Kuhn +2 model, which comes from the work of Virginia Kuhn at USC, Southern Cal, and then various other folks over the years that have refined and evolved this project. And it's meant to be a general sort of heuristic for thinking about different kinds of projects. It comes from their Institute for Multimedia Literacy. And so it doesn't have a clearly defined, like, this is this many points. It's more like, let's start with an orientation to some questions, right? What is the conceptual core of your project? Does it have a controlling idea, right? Is it apparent? Have you done research? Is it significant? Does it make sense for your core? And so these things sort of all sort of mutually inform each other. And if you look at Sheneese's criteria, many of the things she's outlined actually map into this sort of larger heuristic that the Kuhn and folks came up with. But I show this example now because it's really easy to orient questions, right? But because this past fall, I taught this new course called English 171, which is projects in digital literacy. And I had 3 co-instructors with me. So it's this odd model of mentorship and apprenticeship. And they wanted really defined point values for the rubric so they could help with the grading and make their life easier. And they thought students would like it more because you get first-year freshmen who expect to know what exactly the point value is for everything, right? So together, we had this first essay. It's called the Scrolling Digital Essay. And you can click here. I can show you. Basically, they had to use an Adobe Express webpage to create a scrolling digital essay about something that was meaningful to them on campus. And there's the assignment. You can, feel free to use it however you see fit. And it breaks down all the parts, all the expectations. And then the instructors created this rubric, which brought together using the Kuhn +2 model with our traditional first-year comp assessment criteria. They created this hybrid that allowed us to think about these things in similar ways. So now you actually have a description of the thing plus points. So if you're really interested in how these things break down in practice, this is their approach. And the reason why we don't have full-on categorical explanations of what counts as like 40 points is that this was integrated right into our Canvas LMS. And so it's an automated, it lives inside of Canvas, not as a separate doc traditionally. I just PDF'd it so you can see how that all worked. But that's the big one. And then the last one is, this is perhaps the more complex and definitely takes a kind of rethinking about your pedagogical approach, is the learning record method, which comes out of Margaret Syverson's work and I think Mary Farr. And it Peg Syverson, Peg's whole approach was to think about what we assess in student writing, for example, is the product. And if you come in as a C writer and you leave an A writer, your growth is incredible. Or if you come in as an A writer and you leave as an A writer, how much have you really developed? And so the shift was, let's help students understand their own learning, have them catalog and curate evidence from their learning throughout the semester, and then argue for their own grade based on what they've produced and what they've learned. And it's a really unique way of thinking about it. And there's other related models that have come up in the years, like labor grading, ungrading, there's things that work, but this is a little more involved. And there's a link to the Learning Record Method website, which provides a much more robust conversation on this. So those are just some approaches. I think the big thing that is, if you're just doing a one-off, you can easily adapt existing criteria to fit without too much trouble. It's not always a one-to-one system. I mean, going from an essay to a podcast, there are just some differences that can't be assessed in the same way. But for the most part, if you're really focused on content assessment or engagement, then that's not that hard. It's when you start going beyond just one assignment and start thinking about your class as this sort of larger, robust experience and the different kinds of elements in that experience that you might want to start playing across different modalities. So the Kuhn +2 model is something we use in their final projects. And so the co-instructors and myself modified it to fit their first project so they had a kind of introductory experience with it, and it built as we went throughout the course. And I think that those are all part of the bigger conversation, especially if you're introducing criteria for assessment that seem unfamiliar to students or are, this isn't, or when I do a lot of the stuff, it's like, this doesn't have a neat point value, right? I'm more of a holistic approach. Like, how do these things relate? How does your conceptual core operate? And so helping to explain that process to them in detail can also be really important in terms of how they then understand what they're doing. That's the biggest thing we do as teachers. And a lot of this stuff is making explicit the things that help them understand how to be successful. Our syllabus technically does that, but they don't read it. And a lot of it is inferred or implied. And so the more we can be overt and upfront and engage them in the conversation, the better it is on the back end, because they're trying to achieve goals that are not just points on the checklist, but rather meaningful learning engagements for us, right? So that's where I'm at. And we've sort of framed this around those conversations with our own faculty, and then talk about how this leads to different changes in pedagogy and practice, and then how you can adapt it more recently, as you know, Todd, to these wonderful AI stuff. And in fact, I asked ChatGPT how to assess multimedia projects, right? I don't know if I can squeeze this in here. Let me share this one. This is really, I'm gonna give you share whiplash. I'm gonna stop sharing. I'm gonna reshare. Share screen. I think it's this one, right? I'll try that one. And of course, ChatGPT and all of its brilliance. Determine your criteria. Thank you for that. I really appreciate that. That's a good start. Create a rubric. So far, that tells me that I know what I'm doing. And then it's, standard stuff. Review the project, evaluate the content, assess creativity, evaluate technical proficiency. And so this is where you can determine how much you may or may not want to put emphasis on the project. But when in doubt, ask the robots. They know what they're doing, or at least they give you a place to start. As I tell my own students, if you start and end with ChatGPT, you have failed, right? ChatGPT is a starting place. It's like Wikipedia or the library. It's a starting place. It's not the end goal. And so you can start with this as a sort of orientation, both for fun and also relative to our conversation today.
Awesome. As a starting place, I'm going to share a resource, actually a couple of resources. Actually, we'll start with this one. I put this in the chat pod so far. This is a synthesis from the Sweetland Writing Center, which is a wonderful program and institute at the University of Michigan. And what this is a synthesis article on what a number of people have published about multimodal assessment. And so we're going to specifically get into this middle segment where we're going to say, okay, to what extent are things different when students are making a podcast or a film as opposed to a conventional print-oriented approach to academic work? And so this is a collection of some really good thought, and at the bottom, like a Wikipedia entry, there's some really great resources here if you want to dive deeper into seeing what they're talking about. In fact, a couple of these are anthologies. They're entire issues of a journal committed to this question about assessing digital work. And this book here from Heidi McKee and Danielle DeVos does the same thing. It's a collection of perspectives on this. And so that's a resource that I find pretty valuable. And then I think one of the things that we've heard from both of you and that I find in this research on the topic is to begin with the outcomes, begin with the result or the ability or the capacity, or some people think of it as skill, that students the students need to take away from your class in this assignment. And I like at the moment the way these ISTE standards are stated as we focus specifically on digital work. ISTE stands for, I can never remember the acronym, International Society for Technology and Education. And what I really like about these standards is they expand, and they talk about what about abilities that students can create. And so when I'm doing an assignment now, I'm often coming to this and go, as a result of this assignment, I want students to become stronger digital storytellers, which means that they are able to choose the appropriate platforms and tools for meeting the objectives of the project, that they create original works, then responsibly repurpose digital resources such as ChatGPT, which we will get to at the end of this conversation. Completing this assignment will enable students to communicate complex ideas through visualization and digital objects. And so I use these statements of learning outcomes as my North Star. And I find that when I have that North Star, the assessment kind of follows more easily. Does the project that the student produced, does it demonstrate that they have the ability to responsibly repurpose resources, right? Yes or no, point scale. So those are just two resources I want to throw out there real quickly as we now have a conversation among the three of us, beginning with you, Sheneese. Let's try to think of the perspective of someone who's not in your discipline, who hasn't had a lot of experience assigning, let's just say, podcasting. We'll just use that as an example. And they're in, let's just say, an economics class, and they're listening to this cafe that we're having today, trying to figure out how to orient themselves, because the first reaction, and we hear this so often, is I'm intrigued, I want to innovate, but I'm also disoriented to the point that I don't know that I know how to grade a podcast. I've never made one myself. I listen to podcasts, but I've never thought about how I can effectively assess one. And so, Sheneese and Justin, beginning with Sheneese, how fundamentally different are these modalities of academic and intellectual work? Do our rubrics need to be completely rethought? Or does that economics professor not have a lot to worry about as they're thinking about trying these new approaches to student work?
Thank you so much for asking this question. I'm so glad that you shared those course learning outcomes.
Yeah.
Because it absolutely guides what I'm going to say. And it's so much reminded me. And I saw that we had at least one K-12 teacher here. So thank you so much for coming. I used to work in middle school and it informs my pedagogy a whole lot. But I think sometimes we forget that we're educators. Like that's just the primary lens which we should be working through. And I think if we can feel courageous about leaning on our pedagogical tools, that some of the other adjustments that we're making feel less scary, right? Because the foundations are fundamentally the same. And so what I would say to the hypothetical economics professor is that if you're clear about the content that you're assessing for, and I don't know economics, I just listen to the problem with Jon Stewart, and sometimes he talks about SDX, and then I'm just like, what? Crypto? And so let's just say hypothetically, you were assessing for your students' understanding of cryptocurrency and why something like regulation is important. Well, almost all the information I have about this, I have gotten from a podcast, which does not mean I hadn't followed up or hadn't done additional research or some other tie-ins. But I will tell you firmly that I got all of it, almost all of it, from Jon Stewart and his approach. He's interviewed some experts and things like that. But if you know specifically about what you want, do you want them to exhibit understanding, or do you want them to exhibit application, right? But once you understand which one of those things you want, it actually becomes relatively easy to retool, as you would say, an assessment in a digital platform. And so sometimes that does look like a podcast, and sometimes a podcast is an easy connection for a writing assignment. But for my STEM people in the house, we have a Adobe ambassador on campus by the name of Dr. Taisha Burke, and she's in biology, and she started using Adobe Express for students to do composite images to talk about genetic disorder, right? So there are a lot of different things that you could do. Podcasting is one tool, Adobe Express is one tool, Adobe Rush is another. But there are a lot of creative things that you could do as long as you're clear about, am I talking about understanding? Am I talking about application? And which one of those things is forward, and how you would ask the questions of your students.
All right. And so your feeling is if you are clear up front about the real purpose and the real reason of what they're doing, then that makes the rubric follow more directly, so that it won't be as difficult if we have that focal point when we're trying something new.
Yes, so I love this, the student learning outcomes, right? At the end of this assignment, students will be able to, right? And if we're clear about the answers to all those questions, then that gives us a skeletal outline of an assignment.
Right. Great. Justin, what's your perspective on to what extent does assessment change with digital work?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one, I push back a little bit against the ISTE standards as a guiding thing, not because I don't think they're valuable, but I think that a lot of times I try to focus on how do we create meaningful learning experiences. And as the faculty, I can always engineer how they fit these learning outcomes when we're done. But on the students, sometimes it's harder for them to see, like, I don't know how to tell stories, and they don't understand the movement to get there. So I focus on, I don't really highlight them as much until near the end of class. We're doing that kind of reflective, like, here's what you've learned, here's how you've achieved these goals. It's sort of a secondary thing for me. But I think in any discipline, right, I think maybe the single most valuable thing you can do with digital projects as something that might be needed or that just useful is focus on reflection, right? Is to have, you have a student in an economics class who's going to make a podcast or make a video as an option for the final or whatever. Have them explain what they've done. Like, have them tell you, why does it matter? And it's not only good for them and their learning in your class, right? But it's also good practice for when they enter the world of, explain why, you tell me this website costs $10,000 for you to build. Yes, here's why you're paying me. These are my design choices. These why these work. This is why it matters. This is how it operates. This is why, my pay is what it is. And so there's, if anything, I think the single maybe most valuable shift in assessment is including that kind of reflective piece, particularly in disciplines that don't necessarily have it built into what they do, right? But I do think that, you know, what you know how to do translates pretty well no matter the modality. It's just understanding that the way things sound or the way they get represented will be different in a podcast than the way you would write it in a paper. In the same way that when students write traditional academic, let's say, scholarship, I tell them you try not to end the sentence with a preposition, because in writing, that's not how it works. But in speaking, it works like that all the time, right? We end in prepositions all the time. And so knowing your audience, knowing your moment, knowing your performative element, whatever, those things do shift a little bit. But I think, you know, at the core of it is to really think about what is your what can we help students understand from their own learning about what they've just created, not did they just create a project to get out of my class? And that's really, for me, been a lot of the shift, which is I want to assess not only what they've made and the rhetorical strategies they employ in my digital rhetoric class, but their awareness or explanation of that. Because sometimes, you know, Todd, we talked about this yesterday, the other day, sometimes they make really horrible choices in terms of the color palette or design or representation. And I'm like, that is bad, but they can explain what they were trying to do. And while they didn't achieve, you know, what we call industry standard levels of engagement or whatever, representation, their thought process absolutely reflects what is critical to, for me, in terms of they knew what they were trying to get and they thought this might work. They just may have misunderstood their audience, or they don't realize that pink and red, those particular shades are not in fact complementary, right? Right. So there's those kind of things. And I think that's part of the balance. And the other part, and this is actually a question that came up in the Q&A here, about accessibility in these practices. One of the best parts about working in digital media, I think, is it forces us to be incredibly attentive to accessibility. We think that our default line, the most universally accessible thing is text, which may or may not be true, right? But if you have students engage in projects that move across modalities and you make them think about them as being born accessible, not as a third-party add-on, it actually improves their retention and engagement with content, because they have to start thinking about how they represent the same thinking for multiple audiences with multiple different points of access. And, you know, so obviously turning this talk into having an output a transcript that's an easy step, but thinking about how you would close caption this and the decisions you make for sounds or gestures or whatever, you know, those offer a new level of thinking about how you represent it versus, you know, I taught a class on, we did a podcast or audio remix class when I was at UT Austin, and one of the students in the class was deaf. And so how do you teach audio editing to somebody who can't hear, right? It's one of those questions. And it's fascinating. It made me a better teacher. It made the class a better experience because you can absolutely edit audio visually because the waves have certain frequency levels and they, you know, sort of map out over time. And if it's just talking heads, unless it's me, most talking heads have breaks when they talk, right? And so those are part of the bigger picture of not only why you would assess it, but also how you can think about the advantages of bringing this stuff in. It opens up a new way of thinking about assessing your student engagement, which is what are they learning? How can we think about this across modalities and audiences? How do I represent my thinking to somebody who can't hear or who can't see or has arthritis and can't manipulate a mouse? You know, those kinds of levels of accessibility that aren't necessarily prevalent in every project, but are fundamental to how we start talking about bringing digital stuff in the classroom. And then particularly how AI technologies can assist that. I'm thinking about closed captioning in Adobe Premiere Pro, right? Like it's a built-in digital tool.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly
So there's all this fun stuff here in the middle. I don't think it's like a simple, just do what you do, or completely change what you do, but there's somewhere between those and rethinking how we go about those kinds of questions.
Absolutely. And so I think so many of these conversations, I think in a healthy way, end at the same place where on the one hand, what we've always been doing, we're going to continue to do in terms of values, outcomes, abilities we're cultivating. On the other hand, if we are innovating and we're trying to see what we're doing from different perspectives, then we aren't really approaching these technologies in the most critical and forward-looking ways. In other words, if you aren't kind of stumped for a moment, like, wait a minute, I don't know how to put together a rubric for a modality that I've never worked with before. If you aren't kind of stumped by that, then you probably aren't rethinking or re-examining what you're doing in a way. At the same time, we all have to, operate on a Monday morning. And so I think if we want to sort of collect what I've heard from is the best advice as people are experimenting for the first time with these kinds of modalities, it's start with outcomes, with the purpose, and then tailor your rubric and your assessment strategy to get to that. But I'd also like to underscore the important word, the important insight you just had when you talk about reflection. Because the truth is, in my classes, I'm grading the reflection as much as I'm grading the final product. And especially in doing that in a 100 level course or a lower level course, or for a student who's never touched these technologies at all, to get them to see, to make visible their critical and intellectual and cognitive processes that they went through to get to that font choice is more important than the actual font choice itself. And so I think the biggest picture here, especially as we transfer now into a momentary conversation about AI, is we all need to be more critical users and producers and consumers of these technologies. And the best way to do that is to dive in there and let's turn it over and see how things are different, but how some things are the same. And so if we don't take that leap, if we don't create those kinds of opportunities to develop critical perspectives on these technologies, then problems like, issues like accessibility keep getting swept under the rug. If we don't create a podcast and go, now how are we going to make this accessible to someone, then we don't have those conversations to point to those very important aspects of what we're doing in the world of writing, communication, and knowledge sharing. So let's specifically now move into what is on so many people's latest radar, as in North America, typically coming to the end of a term when in January, or you might have put together a syllabus that had no awareness of ChatGPT. And all of a sudden, that's a reality that we know is ever present. Of course, the first knee-jerk reaction is to think about academic integrity in cheating, and that's a fair concern for lots of people. Let's start with you, Sheneese. What is your state of perception regarding the influence of artificial intelligence and Gen Tech technologies into student work? And how does that inflect or change to some degree the way you might be assessing this kind of work and the guidance you would give to your colleagues about assessing digital work in particular? And maybe it doesn't change at all. And that'd be interesting to hear about as well.
Sure. I have to say, admittedly, honestly, transparently, I'm far more laissez-faire than most regarding AI and academic integrity. My position is such that, just as someone who's been teaching for a really long time, is that if students are going to be dishonest, and they're going to be dishonest, they will find new ways or old ways to do that. And it's okay. Not that it's okay in the sense of it's okay to cheat. It isn't. Right. But it's okay because it's a part of the learning experience. That is just something that is a part of a learning community. We have to deal with the fact that it's in the conversation always. So as far as ChatGPT and other kinds of AI, my advice would be the more creative you are in your assessment, the more creative students have to be in their assignment design, right? That's just part of it. Could my students, and I should say again transparently, and I'm going to answer a little bit of the question in the chat too in my response to this. As I said, my institution serves a little over 6,000 students. And so what that means is that our class sizes get to be really intimate and small. And so I've had classes where the top is 25, but I'm currently teaching a class where I only have 5 students. And all of those students have had me as a teacher before. Right? So it's a very different conversation around AI and ChatGPT in my classrooms because I'm not teaching lectures of 300 students. So I want to give you all that information and tell you why that informs my experience. Because the primary thing that drives my pedagogy is learning my students. And so as I get to learn my students and who they are as people, then I can have different conversations with them about how they're responding to my assignments and let them give me feedback about the assignments that I'm designing. But one of the questions in the chat, if I could answer very quickly, is what if the outcome is writing? Well, that's okay. If the outcome of what you're trying to assess is writing, there are a lot of different ways to present writing. And so now we're moving toward Adobe Express or moving toward Adobe Portfolio, and you still get to create something digital, which does present the writing. Or even going back to what Todd offered earlier, InDesign, right? What does it look like to now present all of your students writing in a magazine format? And now you have something that all of your students can take with them when they go. But all of that to say, if I'm asking my students to be creative in the way that they approach the content, right? If I'm asking creative questions, then I think the possibility, and I have to say, I'm also in a really niche field. African American literature, I think, is a little bit more challenging to cheat on. Just because of how the algorithms have been designed. That's a conversation for another day. But I do think that if I'm asking them to be creative, then their ability to use that kind of thing successfully kind of diminishes a little bit. And I should say firmly that my idea to develop a podcast was in response to students writing, right? I asked, they're always writing for me, right? So they have a take home exam where they have a short essay that they have to respond to. And I asked them to put two characters in conversation with each other, and they responded to that in 650 to 700 words of writing. And I said, how cool would this have been as a podcast? And they're like, yes. I'm like, we're doing that next semester. So I think 3 students who are in that class, in the class that's doing it now. So this is all in response to my students learning. And I think that if you're willing to be in tune with what our students have to teach us about concepts, design, assessment, then I think we can stay on the cutting edge of what AI can do for us in our classroom and work with it, as opposed to like running away from it or trying to move through it in a way that's not going to move us away from conversations of academic integrity. So I hope that answers your question.
Oh, it does. Yeah, thank you. Justin, what's your perspective right now?
Let the robots do all the work. That's my no, I mean, seriously, we just had this faculty 3-hour faculty workshop on ChatGPT on my campus for the College of Arts and Sciences. And it was amazing how quickly faculty realized ChatGPT is not in fact good at answering their questions, right? It's going to learn, right? Don't get me wrong. And so it's less a matter of, I mean, the machine it recalls information and then it makes up information. That's what it does. And so if you're an expert in the field, you're going to be able to determine pretty quickly whether or not it's accurate or off. I mean, it thinks I'm from IU, Pennsylvania. Like, it doesn't even know who I am, which is great. So there's those kind of limits to what we're talking about with how these tools work. But I think the biggest thing that happened in these conversations was helping people realize that these are generative tools. They are collaborative tools, and they are meant to be functional assistance toward a larger sort of engagement. And what matters is not that they possibly produce content, but that they give us an opportunity to think more strategically about the kinds of contents we want to include, right? And so whether you're using, an AI generator for text, or whether you're using, Adobe Firefly to create really amazing images, you still have to kind of know what you're looking for when you go in. And so if you don't know and you just copy and paste, you're at a problem with that. But it's there's a rich space for what we think that's going on and what is going to continue to evolve with these technologies. And the crazy thing is, we've been using AI assisted stuff forever, right? It seems like, I mean, nobody seems to complain when Word does a squiggly underneath somebody's paragraph because it's, incorrect, or the auto-generated fill, or, automated imagery manipulations in Photoshop, right? As an example, that, sort of suggests how to do this. You click a button and the machine does it for you. So there's lots of the stuff that's currently in the mix. Just, it's a matter of our initial visceral reaction to, oh, they're going to help students cheat because ChatGPT passed the law exam. Well, that's just, the exam questions were problematic, right? And so if you can ground it in the personal, you can situate it in terms of applying more than just summary. If you can think about synthesis as a goal strategically, as opposed to just summary things, you're going to avoid some of the easy cheatable things, right? But I'm all in. I write about technology and humans as being coagential, right? And that what it does on its own and what I do on my own they have their own focus, but what we do together is what makes it unique. And in that togetherness, it's the human that matters just as much as the tool. And so the more we can prepare students to think about these things with a critical creative attentiveness, the further they can move forward and the quicker they can move forward. I mean, we've been reading news stories written by bots for over a decade on the regular, like even at major outlets. So the concepts of that is not new. It's just our exposure to it has become hypersaturated in the last 3 months or 6 months or whatever the case may be. I don't know if it changes your assessment. I think one of the more interesting things I've seen with some of the technologies available is that you can have it help create assessment criteria. You can have it provide evaluative feedback, like helping give you a starting point for feedback on work. I'm not saying I would go that far. I prefer audio and video feedback, but the space that we can play in right now with this AI stuff, as it interfaces with the digital literacy conversation, as it interfaces with student learning, it's not a slippery slope to the doldrums of, oh my goodness, everybody's cheating their way through college. Most people have cheated their way through college anyways. That's not new, right? So, but when you create an assignment that's engaging, you have an opportunity for students to be invested, when you're passionate about your work and their life, things aren't in the way. Students typically do not want to cheat, particularly if it's fun and it's engaging. They don't want to cheat. It's when it's boring or routine, and or they're already overwhelmed by the rest of their life that it's easy to just say, well, let me do this, right? And I think there's a question in the chat here too about teaching this stuff online. I teach all this stuff online at different times, whether we're making videos or audio or making interactive web text. The learning strategies shift a little bit because, if I'm teaching you how to make a video in Adobe Premiere Rush, for example, students are typically on one screen. And so they can't click along and do the same steps. So it's more like I show you one and then they do the model based on some instructional assets that I've given them. So some of the pedagogical things shift, but the projects are just the same. The ability to do them is just the same. And I'm fortunate on a campus that has access to remote technology. So students who are from our rural campuses can, access a remote desktop and still get those sort of quality engagements. But there's lots of ways of doing this stuff across different technologies. I just think it's online or in person. It's how do we think about the approach and how do we work with these tools to really help improve our engagement with students.
And just to add quickly, yes, all of my courses are actually hybrid. So I do one in person, one virtual, and I do have one online asynchronous composition course as well. So just to add and agree to what Justin was saying.
Yeah, and I was just joking about that most people cheat their way through college, by the way. Don't take that literally. But students have been trying to find a way to cheat since we've started having exams, right? That's not new.
And to add to that, cheating is about making your work easier, right? So if we're creating assignments where cheating is harder than doing the work, then it becomes significantly less attractive to cheat. And I think that's a conversation that we should have as well. And just to continue the conversation briefly, the population of students I'm teaching are going to be in a workforce where they're going to be competing with students who have access to technology that many of them don't have access to. So I feel that I'd be doing my students a disservice if I'm not introducing these technologies into the classroom to help get them ready for what's coming, right? So for example, we were having conversations about Grammarly, right? Like where is the ethical line about Grammarly? Like if students are using Grammarly to check their work, is that cheating, right? And so now we're at the logical end of that conversation now that we've arrived at ChatGPT. But this technology is going to keep coming. So if I was telling my students now that it would make more ethical sense for them to use a typewriter as opposed to a word processor, I'd be making them less competitive on the job market and doing them a disservice. So for me, I have a different set of priorities in terms of what does it look like to prepare my students in particular, as we'll talk about the digital divide next week, in terms of what they're going to be competing against as they go out into this job market, despite no matter what their field is. So I hope that answers some questions as well.
Absolutely. And so I finally saw the cartoon that I was expecting to see for many weeks now, where two professors are sitting around and one professor says, well, if my students are going to use ChatGPT to write their papers, I'm going to use it to mark them up or grade them. For those folks who've been using plagiarism checkers, you've already been using artificial intelligence to assess student work in some degree. And so I think the consensus is, first of all, we don't know where this technology is going to be in 6 months or a year or 5 years from now. We know it's going to continue to advance. The consensus also seems to be that trying to play a game of having AI checkers to look at a piece of student work to see if it has been created in AI, that's also a competition that no one's ever going to win and settle. And so the consensus I'm hearing is that we want to integrate and we want to work with our students to figure out how to integrate these technologies in ethical ways that prepares them for the future in the world that is evolving. So that, again, we come back to this point of enabling us all together to be critical users and producers of knowledge and ideas with all of these technologies. At the same time, there are people who have large lecture classes with 300 people writing papers and essays. And those folks need help and orientation and thinking through all of this together. And so I thank you, everyone on the call, and especially our guests for helping us do that in April of 2023. We should probably repeat this entire experience a year from now. So grateful to everyone. We are going to email a follow-up to everyone who participated that will include a link to the recording and a link to as many resources as our guests can share. All the links we showed, and if Sheneese, if you're comfortable sharing your syllabus and your assignment prompt, Justin, you already had a lot of that embedded. That will all go out that way. Thank you so much for being a part of this community and helping us, and thank you especially to Sheneese and Justin for the great insights you shared today. We're very appreciative of everything you shared with us and showed us today. So, any final swan song, last comments from you?
Thanks for having us, Todd. We appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it so much.
Thanks for hanging out in my clubhouse. The next Digital Literacy Cafe is, I believe, I'm correct, and Paula, correct me if I'm wrong, it's May 24th, and it's going to be how the world needs student digital storytellers to address the world's wicked problems. And our guest will be Harry Givens from McGill University, talking about her book, Radical Empathy. And Frank Sesno from George Washington University, talking about the Planet Forward movement. And Professor Eddie Webb, who's going to share the work he's been doing with tribal film festivals. And so I'm really looking forward to that conversation. I hope you all able to tune in about a month from now on our next in the series of cafes, when we're going to talk about digital storytellers to help solve the world's wicked problems. Thanks everyone for being here today.